Good morning, all of you. We are going to take up today Leigh Hunt as an essayist. This discussion is based on David R. Cheney's analysis of Leigh Hunt as an essayist. Leigh Hunt made a name for himself as a poet, critic, journalist, editor, and essayist. But he was probably best known in his own time as an essayist. As Hunt noted in a letter, even his friends thought he was superior at writing essays, and as J.B. Priestley pointed out, had Hunt not worked side by side with Lamb and Hazlitt, he might have enjoyed a greater reputation as an essayist. Unfortunately, it has been the strange fashion, as Priestley illustrates, to diminish the merits of Hunt's essays by emphasizing their inferiority to the essays of his contemporaries. Langland is not depreciated because Chaucer is the greatest writer, nor is Johnson because Shakespeare is the greater dramatist, nor is Marvell because Milton is the greater poet. But Hunt frequently suffers such depreciatory comparisons. To make matters worse, the reading of essays, and Hunt's best work is in his essays, is no longer very popular. As a result of these two phenomena, Leigh Hunt's reputation had undergone something of an eclipse. This undeserved disparaging of Hunt's essays is unfortunate because even though one would have to agree with Ian Jack that in the essay Hunt does not reach the highest class, still, as James R. Thompson suggests, the general quality of his periodical writing was surprisingly high considering the bulk. Hunt wrote three distinct kinds of essays: critical, political, and familiar. His essays, those published in The Traveller in 1804 over the signature of Mr. Towne, Critic and Censor General, were critical. In 1805 to 1807, he published a number of articles of dramatic criticism in The News. And of course, The Examiner printed many critical and political articles over the years when Hunt was editor. But the kind of essays that Hunt was master of, perhaps no one in the 19th century other than Lamb wrote better ones, were the familiar essays. Many of them appeared in journals of which he was an editor: Reflector from 1811 to 12, Indicator from 1819 to 21, Liberal 1822-23, Companion 1828, Tatler 1830 to 1832, Leigh Hunt's London Journal 1834 to 35, and Leigh Hunt's Journal, that was in 1850 to 51. He also published essays in many other journals, but the best of his familiar essays appeared in The Indicator, Companion, and Leigh Hunt's London Journal. Students, you should be able to answer in case you are asked in your examination to name any two journals or any of the journal or a few journals with which Leigh Hunt was associated. And in that case, you can mention Indicator, Companion, Leigh Hunt's London Journal, and the others which we have right now discussed. The topics of the familiar essays were wide-ranging. No other contemporary essayist wrote on so many as his son Thornton noted. Few essays have equaled or approached Leigh Hunt in the combined versatility, invention, and finish of his miscellaneous prose writings. Hunt wrote of various activities from dancing to pig driving, of people ancient and contemporary, real and imaginary, of everyday life, of holidays, of places from Pisa to St. Paul's, of windows and sticks. He wrote character sketches of old men, old women, maidservants, and washerwomen. He told stories, but mostly he wrote about nature, hot days, cold days, rainy days, May days, spring and autumn, daisies and pigeons, and literature, poetry and poets, drama and dramatists. The essay prescribed for you by Leigh Hunt, Getting Up on Cold Mornings, also belongs to this category in which he wrote about nature, that is, cold days. One distinctive feature of all the familiar essays is that, as Louis Landry wrote, I begin the quote here, Leigh Hunt is always present in his essays, more openly than Hazlitt in his, whether he comments about what he describes or recollects, makes us share in his sentiments and beliefs, or discusses moments of his own life, or expresses his views on people he has been acquainted with. This is different from the traditional 18th century essay, which was Hunt's model, in that the 18th century essayist used a spokesman or persona. Perhaps Hunt developed the trait from the essays he wrote in his letters, where he was, of course, writing in his own person. Being something of a child prodigy, Hunt apparently was always able to write a finished first draft. This is evident from his letters, which all maintain a high level of writing, and yet few of them seem to have been rewritten, and corrections are relatively rare. Indeed, parts of many of the letters could have been published as essays. The ability to write rapidly and well certainly contributed both to his success as a journalist and as an essayist who was constantly forced to write for money. But it may also have contributed to the unevenness of the essays, which has usually been ascribed to such things as the fact that Hunt had no time for revision, that he frequently had no control over the choice of topic, that his interests were so many that he spread himself too thin. The fact is that the mere ability to write so well without correction may have discouraged Hunt from doing the hard work of revision. After all, when the draft was of such high quality, even the most rigorous revision could achieve only minimal improvement, which to Hunt could consequently seem not worth the trouble, even if he had had the time. It thus may be that, as Priestley has said, it is doubtful that a more leisurely method of production would have made him a better essayist. Whether the essays would have been improved by giving them a formal unity is also a question with Hunt. As it is, any unity is to be sought in the subjective unity of free association, which Hunt used. Indeed, essays may not stick to any one subject or to any one tone. They tend to skip about freely, now serious, now humorous, touching on points that seem only lightly related to the announced topic, which is begun and written about until the required space is filled with seemingly no particular end in mind. Even so, one does not sense a lack of unity, and there is always a pleasantness, a cheerfulness, frequently a gaiety about the essays. Many have what Watson calls, quote, a spontaneity, a vivacity, a good-naturedness that characterize much of Hunt's writing, unquote. In short, the essays seem to have been written primarily to give pleasure, and despite all the flaws and weaknesses that have been attributed to them, most of the essays are enjoyable. For the most part, critics of Hunt's essays have been satisfied merely to comment on the essays with slight illustration from them. It would seem good, therefore, especially since much of the previous criticism has been critical of the essays, to follow Hunt's practice in writing criticisms of authors and quote amply from his writings. Besides, some extended quotations illustrating various characteristics in the essays should demonstrate, among other things, that first, for years before the earliest familiar essay was published, Hunt had been practicing the technique in his personal letters. And second, that the essays are much better than they are usually thought to be. That indeed Hunt could be a fine essayist. Though Hunt's earliest published familiar essays appeared in the Reflector in 1811, he had been writing essays as early as 1803 in his letters to Mariana Kent, who was to become his wife in 1809. Of course, there was a tradition from the 18th century of writing essays in letter form, and some of Hunt's published essays follow the tradition. But that he was consciously writing essays within his letters is demonstrated by the fact that Hunt abruptly stopped sometimes in the middle of a letter to say that he had drifted into writing an essay. Moreover, the essays in the letters, as they may be called, contain various notable characteristics found in Hunt's published essays, such as descriptions of places, character sketches, anecdotes, and narratives. A comparison between passages from early letters and from later published essays demonstrates that similarity of technique and mood. It is to be noted, for example, that parts of some of the letters, particularly those describing trips to Oxford, Cambridge, Lincoln, and Nottingham, have very much the tone, movement, and vivid description or the depiction of places in later published essays. Indeed, the descriptions in letters and essays both follow Hunt's suggestion of the ideal way to describe places, as stated in a letter to J. W. Delby, in which Hunt was commenting on Delby's method of writing in the Northampton Mercury. I quote here, "I hope also you will ramble and peregrinate on paper till your readers tell you to stop, which they will be in no hurry to do if they are of my mind. For an enjoyment of localities after that fashion combines the novelty of the particular portrait with the expression of feelings common and delightful to us all, at least all who are capable of delight. And I know of very few kinds of writing indeed that are most desirable." As an example of the description of a place in a letter, Hunt wrote to Marianne on February 13, 1806, describing Lincoln as, quote, "an ancient and popular city, rising on a hill, and built originally in the Gothic style, or rather in the Saracen. For the architecture usually supposed to be borrowed from the Goths or northern nations of Europe, was first introduced into Spain by its conquerors, the Saracens. The city is overlooked by a noble cathedral, and which always appears to me like so much useless lace work. This intricate cutting and carving, however, certainly adds to the venerable aspect of such structures, probably from the same reason that wrinkles adorn a fine old face. Some of the ornaments, nevertheless, astonished me. They were such as I had never seen and certainly never expected in these holy edifices, and consisted of a range of grotesque faces, just like the hideous masks of a pantomime. Some grinned at you with cheeks puckered up and mouths wide open. Others shut their eyes and twisted their noses as if they were mocking the holy doings within. The others hung their heads and poked out their jaws as if they were afflicted with the toothache. These comic visages mingled with swelled cheeks, cherubims, and long bearded saints with now and then a little devil peeping over a pillar, presented a singular mixture of celestial and infernal ideas. And it seemed as if the architect had wished to express his contempt for superstition by introducing its champions into such company. Unquote. A comparison with a similar description in the essay Genoa, which appeared in 1822, shows not only the same careful attention to detail, which Leigh Hunt paid is noteworthy here, but also the same sense of personality behind the words, as found particularly in the occasional commentary on the scene described. So, he has given details of attention to the scene which he was describing. Genoa is truly Genoa the super. Its finest aspect is from the sea, and from the sea I first beheld it. Imagine a glorious amphitheatre of white houses with mountains on each side and at the back. The base is composed of the city with its churches and shipping. The other houses are country seats looking out, one above the other up the hill. To the left are the Alps with their snowy tops. To the right and for the back are the Apennines. This is Genoa. It is situate at the very angle of the pointed gulf, which is called after its name and which presents on either side, as you sail up it, white villages, country seats, and olive groves. In Genoa, after passing through Goldsmith Street and another that leads up from it, you come out of the post office upon the Piazza del Fontenamos, the place of the amorous fountains. And then the description goes on and on about the place. Next to it, we can move on to discuss Hunt's character sketches, which we will take up in our next part of discussion. For today, let us give a pause. Thank you.